got Jenny Molloy, who is from the University of Cambridge, and she's talking about common threads in open and decentralised science. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much, and it's great to see you all. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me. So my name's Jenny Molloy. I'm based at the University of Cambridge, but I also work with a number of organisations in the field of open tools for mostly biotechnology and the bioeconomy. But I'm here really to sort of contextualise some of the common threads that I've seen emerging in the decentralised science arena, which I'm very new to, and also open science, which I'm not so new to, and is a kind of movement that's been growing for a couple of decades now, but has branched out to new realms. And so this is going to be a very short and reasonably kind of personal oversight of where I think there's some commonalities in the approach, and where I think there are questions that open science is grappling with that decentralised science should probably also be considering if it isn't already. But I think the main thread that I think ties these two movements together is it's reimagining knowledge production, but catalysed by new technology. And the open science movement really emerged because of the internet, effectively, and how that can kind of lead to greater sharing of knowledge, but originally in a very kind of one way. So sharing of knowledge freely online for people to read, so the open access movement, in order to publish academic articles and other kind of products of science that are very familiar to us, but in a way that everybody could not only read them, but also use that knowledge in different ways. So it's really a movement to kind of free copyright and enable that copyright to be licensed in ways where people could use it. But then the web moved on, and so then really open science also started being more about participation in science online, and now Web3 is offering these kind of totally new structures. And so I think that these two movements are very clearly connected. So in terms of the open science movement, what does open mean? Well, many things. And I think this is a slide from Cameron Naylan, who was a very early proponent of open access and a really deep thinker in this space, really talking about sharing what we already create. Because like I said, originally, open science was taking science as it existed and making the products of that science more open. So this is true, but I think it represents a very kind of early stage of the open science movement or community. And really the focus at the time that this was all coming about, the original open access movement, the original open data and science communities and thinking, were really around licensing. So something was considered open if anyone is free to use, reuse and redistribute it, subject only at most to the requirement to attribute and or share alike. So you can see already, it got quite technical in terms of how you would legally make this stuff available. And this is a quote from the opendefinition.org, which didn't only apply to open science, but was also, there was a big movement in the early 2000s really around openness in all sorts of data, government, businesses, all walks of life, thinking about how to make content more open. But I think really openness spreads beyond that, and that's what I think the decentralized science movement is really kind of pushing forward, are these other aspects of open. So I quite like the definitions that the International Development Research Centre put forward when they were thinking about openness in terms of information technologies for development. So number one is universal versus restricted access. You're providing mechanisms for organising knowledge production in a decentralised way, in your case, or in any kind of way, an open way, in the open case, that favours universal versus restricted access. So in my work, we were on developing toolkits for synthetic biology, which are openly available, unencumbered by intellectual property. They're in the public domain and anybody can use them. But you can apply the same principle to all sorts of digital goods. And then secondly, universal versus restricted participation. So greater involvement of beneficiaries in shaping projects using open tools. And I think that's an area where there's really very clearly a lot of decentralized science initiatives in that area. I was just chatting before the course a little bit about the Fleming Protocol and how you can actually involve people in having agency to drive forward science. And that also kind of leads on to the third point, which is this idea of having collaborative versus decentralized production. Interestingly, at the time this was written, all the way back in 2008, they didn't use the word decentralized, they used the word collaborative. And I'll leave you to decide whether collaborative and decentralized are kind of the same sort of thing, or maybe decentralized is a step beyond collaborative. but this idea of having multiple partners working together for a common goal. And I think all of the work around DAOs and distributed governance is really kind of playing into this third part. So for me, there's a really strong link between the open science kind of principles and thinking and approach and what the decentralized science community, as I understand it, is attempting to achieve. But I think that sometimes we need to go beyond this when we're thinking about where and why and how to make something open. And that's something that the open science movement have been tackling, both at just a very pragmatic level of how much stuff do you make open, because it's a lot of effort. So there's been discussion of principles such as intelligent open science, deciding how much it's worth, putting the effort into making reusable, and things like not just open source, but useful source. Have you actually documented something in such a way that it's reusable downstream, as opposed to simply slapping a license on it that technically makes it open? So whenever you kind of dive into any of these areas, there's always more consideration in terms of the actual mechanisms and the actual outcomes that you're intending to achieve. I think in terms of an observed pattern that I've seen in open science, and will be interesting to observe in the decentralized science space, is that it starts with a really passionate community. So I'm sure that all of you here are here because you see that this is, a future that you want to happen in the world. And that was very much the kind of earlier open science meetings were fervent and kind of very motivated and passionate people coming together to say, we need this change to happen, and how do we make it happen? And over time, you are successful, which is great news. And things start getting adopted and they start getting institutionalized. So, open data, for example, I would say is pretty institutionalized now. Funders have open data mandates. It's discussed. Graduate students routinely get taught how to share their data openly. And that kind of leads to some expansion of scope for the community, because that community typically has a vision of a much bigger reconfiguration of knowledge production and a much bigger disruption to the system. So as soon as the system starts actually adapting to what they're saying in small ways, I've seen a lot of people who were in that original movement expand their scope. And so this is one of the reasons that my passion now is in terms of open hardware and open biology and open tool sharing, because I see open access and open data is kind of going to happen anyway, regardless of where I spend my time. It's not there yet, but it's institutionalized enough to the point where there's professionalization and there are roles in universities that are taking this forward. And so you see the kind of real passionate advocates and activists coming out into other areas. And I think we'll hear more from Tamara on kind of some of the work that's been done in this area as well. So I think, I don't know what that's going to look like for decentralized science, but I think it's a pattern that I would anticipate will also happen as more and as you are successful and people start adopting these approaches more broadly. And as an example, this is in 2009, a group of us in Cambridge met at the Panton Arms pub and produced the Panton Principles, which were principles for open data in science. It's me and a small number of other people, including John Wilbanks from Creative Commons, Rufus Pollock from the Open Knowledge Foundation, as it was at the time, Cameron Nayland, Peter Murray Rust. At the time, there were no principles for open data in science. There was sort of discussion on forums and mailing lists. And so if you fast forward to 2022, there's been a whole shift in how people think about open data. So just to illustrate that even within that reasonably short period of time, something can switch. It doesn't mean it's totally there. There's still a lot of work to be done to make open data in science the kind of the default approach, but it did happen. So there's scope for success. And also just the sort of massive expansion of technology. I mean, at this time, the very radical discussion was, should we be commenting on scientific articles on the internet? so like the technology has just expanded, and I am not a Web3 expert in any way, shape or form, but I think I've been to enough talks about it to understand some of the disruptive potential. And it's really exciting. It was an exciting place to be in 2009 with open data. And I kind of, from the Twitter stream and live stream yesterday, I got the sense that it's an exciting place to be in this room right now, thinking about what 10 years time might look like for decentralized science. Because we didn't know at that point that open data would happen in the way that it has done. And as I say, there's many other topics that are still very much, there's work to be to be done and to succeed in terms of collaborative science, in terms of open hardware, open wetware, and other areas. And then I think the thing that open science has been really addressing in part for the last 10 years, in the early days, there was a lot of advocacy and kind of, we need to try these things out, we need to experiment, we need to do stuff. And so there was a lot of activity, and then really a kind of questioning of who is actually benefiting from that activity. And so I think in terms of open as an approach, actually questioning why, when, where, and how we should employ it and for what ends is always extremely important. And from what I've seen, many of the decentralized science initiatives are already asking those questions. But I think just as a sort of, this is a personal reflection on where I think open source approaches make most sense. And I think there is some overlap with the decentralized approach as well. So accelerating research and development. Again, Cameron Nayland was very conceptualized a lot of the early work in open science about reducing friction, mostly reducing friction in access to knowledge. And I think that access is still very important, but also reducing friction in terms of access to collaborators, in terms of access to funding, not an issue addressed by open science, but I know a real kind of point of focus for many in the room. User innovation, so how to get more diverse ideas and expanding pool of developers. I think that makes a lot of sense for open source approaches, and we've seen that played out, I think, unquestionably in open source software. And then it kind of allows you to focus on the value add. So in certain contexts, if you're not focused so much on kind of protecting or doing all of the things that will keep knowledge close to you, then you can really shift your focus onto how to share know-how, how to build collaborations and community, how to build trust and buy-in. And so I think those are some of the areas where open source works really well. And there's others where it's not so useful. So there may be a need for capital. Open source can be a route to profit, but it's often not a route to maximizing profits. And so that can be a challenge in terms of business models. Sometimes you do need to defend or control your intellectual property for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's to maintain values of quality, for example. I work a lot in thinking about distributed or decentralized manufacturing of research reagents and diagnostics, where quality is a really key factor. And also thinking about protecting the equitable distribution of your product as well has been used by some companies as a reason for maintaining control over intellectual property. That kind of, in essence, has little to do with some of the other motivations that are usually cited. And also, it doesn't work if it won't be used. If it's a distraction or no one's going to adapt or use it, the effort needed to document an open hardware project is effectively wasted, or any other kind of open source project. And so that goes back to this idea of kind of intelligent open source and really thinking about where the effort should most go. And I don't know what these sets of criteria look like for decentralized science, but I think it would be an interesting thing to think about for your own projects of, you know, to what decentralized science is an approach, I think, in the same way that open science is, and sometimes it's more effective than others. And so I already mentioned, but open science has tackled and not fully answered what I think are important questions for decentralized science as well. For example, for whose benefits and to what extent will this promote access and equity if those are your goals? They may not be the goals and you're applying the approach for a different reason. But for me, a lot of my work is around how to distribute biomanufacturing and biotechnology tools to promote equity, particularly in low and middle income countries, and how to create a kind of globally equitable bioeconomy. And so I employ open source approaches and a distributed approach because that makes just the most sense in terms of the problem that we're trying to tackle. For example, I was in Argentina before Christmas, and we're looking at manufacturing reagents in country in Argentina in a kind of local production and distributed way. And economically, there's huge inflation, 100% inflation in Argentina, and issues with getting foreign currency to buy stuff on the open market. Biology is self-replicating, and if you know how to grow biology and make enzymes, then in principle, once you've got the strains and some fairly kind of basic inputs into the protocol, you have a reasonably infinite is entirely the wrong word, but effectively you can keep producing your reagents yourself without relying on people from outside to provide them for you. And so for a lot of my work, I consider decentralization and sort of distribution in terms of increasing autonomy. And for me, that's autonomy in terms of access to tools, and also autonomy in terms of the agency to shape the biotechnology field and agenda, because you can get on with your work and address the problems that you want to address without relying on international collaborators or funders to supply your needs. And so I sort of see there's a kind of a parallel in terms of how the decentralized science movement is trying to shift those power structures. And yeah, I'm very interested in engaging with you all today and taking some questions. I've tried to keep stuff short so that we can have a discussion, and looking forward to meeting you all. And I'll just summarize with, I think the common thread between these two approaches is that we're both trying to reinvent or reimagine knowledge production, and we're both applying kind of new technologies and tools to do that. And I think we both have some very common advantages in terms of the approach, but also some very common potential challenges and potential unforeseen consequences to consider. And so I really hope that the two communities, which already overlap to a reasonable extent anyway, can just continue kind of learning from each other as the decentralized science movement spreads, which I'm sure it will do in the same way that we've seen open science expand in the last decade, if not two. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, that's fascinating. Okay, we have a couple of minutes for questions if anybody has. Yes, I'm going to pass the box back to you. I'll do half an hour.
Okay, thank you. So I find it really interesting how open science, and I guess all movements start that way, looking towards the future, super, passionate, motivated, and then you get 30% of the way there. So I was wondering, what do you think is the biggest points in that multiplicative factor that from the vision to 10 years later, what's actually realized? Is it regulators, pushback from institutions? How has that been for open science, and maybe how can we in DeSci try, and do better?
Yeah, I think with open science, it was definitely understanding. So open science had a focus on institutional science, which I think does make it different from decentralized science. And in institutional science, at least the open access, open data, and other movements that are really embedded, the people that have the power are effectively the funders and the policymakers that set the kind of national and international approaches. And so as soon as you get it into their policies and their funding, further down the chain, the institutions will typically kind of do what they're told. So understanding who has the power and attempting to make them change it. But I think that in a sense is kind of counter to what the decentralized science movement is trying to do. So open science really trying to centralized, looked for the central powers and attempted to change them. So I'm not sure you can follow that route, but I feel like that's really where it kind of, it managed to push things along. And then it continues to push things along, but now from a kind of seat of being more accepted, but not globally. I still end up in rooms with institutions and particularly technology transfer offices talking about their fears for open science. I'd say less so on the open access. I think other than the business model, there's limited fear of that. And there was a lot of fear in the early 2000s around open access. There still is some to an extent. Open data is a bit more tricky. But yeah, when you start talking about kind of open source, that's a real challenge to kind of embed in institutions, and we haven't cracked that one. So yeah, identify who you really want to move, and then have some targeted approaches to get to them.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, but for example, one more very quick question. This one. Yes, over here. Can you crowd pass or throw? Cool.
That was a good toss. So a lot of this comes down to capital efficiency, right? So where's the money coming from, and what's the expected return from the parties that are providing it? And if we look at something like venture capital funded biotech, right, there's going to be expectations of return. So given there's a trade-off there between the expectations of funders and, conceivably the impact and the ability to decentralize and not expect that return, are there areas that you think you would be more open to DeSci or open science approaches that there's not going to be that expectation from the people funding it to get an outsized return back?
Yeah, it's interesting because I note that a lot, I guess partly because this event is at the Crick and just the nature of the people that have invited, a lot of biotech happening, and actually that's usually the field, despite the fact I'm in it, but I use as an example of a field that it's because of the capital return expectations, it's very difficult to embed ideas of openness, and I'm guessing decentralization as well. I haven't talked so much to people. I feel like that's not necessarily the case in all industries, and sometimes from the biotech end, we kind of get very blinkered in terms of kind of how business is done. So I feel like there's other industries that rely much less on intellectual property protection because they need less massive capital investment, right? And I think different levels of pace of innovation as well. Biotech is slow, typically speaking. Of course, many of us are working on making it faster. But I think one of the reasons that stuff has worked so well in software, and for example, artificial intelligence, of course, there's a lot of IP, but there's a huge kind of adoption of open science and also, I think, decentralized approaches. But partly because the innovation is just moving so fast, there's so little point in protecting something that's already going to be kind of worked around by 10 groups and completely transformed within the next 6 months. So I feel like anywhere where there's super fast innovation or where the kind of capital requirements are somewhat lower, and you can really then look at kind of as a business, if you're talking about business return, what's the value add? Because there are so many industries where money is made on marketing and branding and actually selling the product and the business functions, not so much on the kind of intellectual property around the product itself. So I don't have any specific kind of, you should be looking at this particular sector, but I think just rethinking the role of decentralization or open source in the business model and being realistic about where it's going to work and where it's not. I would love that, more biotech was open, but I think that it's tough. It's very difficult to get that to work for the reasons you said.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.